Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with David Pearce. David, for everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, good heavens. Well,
The sigh was perfect. The sigh was
perfect. Edited highlights. Now, back in 1995, I wrote an online manifesto, The Hedonistic Imperative, which calls for the use of biotechnology to phase out suffering throughout the living world and its replacement by gradients of intelligent bliss. And a couple of years later, a young postgrad called Nick Bostrom got in touch, and we set up the World Transhumanist Association, now rebranded Humanity Plus. Now, a lot has happened in the past quarter of a century or so. I won't even attempt to give potted highlights, but yeah, fairly obvious question. What is a transhumanist? Crudely, transhumanists believe in the creation of a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. And I'm sure we can explore each of these three supers in turn. My own preoccupation, though, I confess, has very much been the problem of suffering. It's an ancient problem. I mean, you could say I'm a secular Buddhist, but the difference between traditional approaches to the problem of suffering is that none of them offered the technical tools to phase out misery and malaise. Whereas the wonderful thing about biotechnology, for all its pitfalls, is that one can sketch out how it's possible to phase out all experience below hedonic zero and replace it with life based on gradients of intelligent bliss.
The question of trying to find happiness or not trying to be miserable, it always seems like the human species in general just can always find a way to be miserable. I don't know if the essential perfect happiness is really a thing. I think you have happy days and happy moments, but a happy lifetime is the true question. How do I achieve that? Or how do I get everyone on the same level to achieve that as well too? I think we all are intentionally happy, but we all face problems and bad days, I would say, especially with the rise in mental health. But I've talked to so many biomechanical engineers about this subject of using technology to maybe advance human life. And I think everyone thinks in the possible small circles of, oh, yeah, Google or Alexa or all these devices that you can use to make your life easier at home. And then the question asks, when do we start using tech to incorporate it into ourselves as well, too, which is a great idea. I just don't know, besides maybe some medical things, like if you're able to add something into your head to be able to maybe fix a certain problem that can't be done, but besides anything else, maybe schizophrenia, maybe if technology gets to that point. I don't know where it's at now, but what do you think it could be used for to increase happiness or reduce misery in a sense?
Each of us has a suite of negative feedback mechanisms, the so-called hedonic treadmill, and it has been designed by evolution to ensure that none of us, or almost none of us, are very happy for very long, because discontent is fitness enhancing. Sitting around counting one's blessings, it's genetically maladaptive. So always wanting more, whether more wealth, more status, more reproductive opportunities, is part of what it means to be human. And if we are ethically serious in tackling the problem of suffering and creating a biohappiness revolution, we are going to need to tackle the negative feedback mechanisms of the hedonic treadmill. That there is simply no evidence that on average, the average person is any happier than our ancestors on the African savannah. That if you look at the incidence of of pain disorders, clinical and subclinical depression, mental health. For example, according to the World Health Organization, hundreds of millions of people in the world today suffer from clinical depression. Hundreds millions more suffer from subclinical depression. Uh, it, Essentially, we're going to need to tackle the biological genetic roots of the problem. And we can, if you're interested, yeah, I can sketch out some of the ways to do so.
Would that be like gene editing?
Gene editing, which is going to be possible both for existing humans. The first trials are already underway for existing well-known genetic disorders, but it's going to be possible to, with a few genetic tweaks, give you benign versions of a handful of genes, let's say the far out gene, the COMT gene, the SCN9A gene, and ensure that you have an extremely high pain threshold and extremely high hedonic set point. So I'm using a bit of jargon here. Hedonic set point is just the average level of well-being or ill-being that most people experience in the course of a lifetime. Some people, by today's standards, are pretty lucky. They have a relatively elevated hedonic set point, and they go through life for the most part, animated by gradients of well-being. Sadly, most people are not so fortunate. They either fluctuate just a little bit above or below hedonic zero, or tragically, in some cases, a large minority of cases, are chronically depressive. But critically, it's going to be a matter of choice, both for existing human and non-human animals, and very controversial this too, we're going to be able to do germline editing. We've seen the first CRISPR babies in China. I, as a transhumanist, would urge universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, soon CRISPR genome editing for all prospective parents. That all kids born today are unique, untested genetic experiments, and if one does consider it ethical to bring new life and suffering into the world, I think one has a moral obligation to load the genetic dice in one's children's favor.
I think the beneficial aspect would be if you had a kid that was going to be born with autism, you could fix that with CRISPR. But the issue that I think where people start to find it's unethical is only because they start thinking of superhumans. Like maybe it goes from adjusting the autism spectrum to maybe I want my baby to have blue eyes, or maybe I want, and we don't know where technology is going to kind of go. So hypothetically, if you can make your baby really good at sports or really, really funny, you can boost certain personality traits. And that's kind of seen it for a lot of people to be like, that's just unfair because it's kind of like, you know, a lot of that stuff could be an advantage or disadvantage to parents because people are going to have different viewpoints on it. People are going to want a CRISPR baby and some really don't. They want to do it the natural and just have the gamble of life type way. My kind of focus or interest would be where can we implement this with depression? For instance, I have clinical depression. Yeah, I have your good days and bad days, but when yeah, those lows are really low. So I'm wondering, is it increasing the pain threshold to make sure that maybe someone doesn't have to get depressed or someone doesn't have to hit those lows? Or if we talk about depression is just something that can miraculously hit you whenever. It could be trauma induced. There's people that go to war that have severe PTSD, for instance. I would see that as a benefit to be able to make sure that we can fix those types of PTSD reactions instead of using electroconvulsive therapy. I don't know if I'm going way out into left field on it, but I'm just trying to think of proper mechanisms that we could incorporate that could sales pitch it in the best possible way for the general public. Because sadly, when you talk about a discussion like this without people getting lost in the weeds, they immediately jump to sci-fi. Like, I get a robotic arm. It's like, well, necessarily, that's not really exactly the point of where we're talking about. That could be a potential, maybe, but it's about excelling human life, or really in a sense making it an overall better than what it is now. And I feel like with the a massive amount of, as much as you might see on social media with the environmental things, I think your environment plays a big factor in who you are as a person. With it comes to your mood as well too. But I don't really see us downsizing in a sense, or have the capacity to be able to understand downsizing when, like you said in the beginning, people kind of just want a little bit more.
Yes, I mean, most people say, I think sincerely, that they want their children to be happy. And yet, the only way I know to create a biohappiness revolution is to tweak uh, genomes. Uh, and you can look at, rather than invoking sci fi, one can look at existing case studies of today's hedonic outliers. I mean, someone like Jo Cameron, a Scottish lady, was in the news a couple of years ago because of her exceptionally high pain threshold. She's a 73, 74-year-old retired vegan Scottish school teacher, never anxious, never depressed, waved away painkillers for a trapeziectomy, which is normally extremely painful. Childbirth to her felt like a tickle, self-reportedly so. There are problems having a pain threshold or a hedonic set point quite as high as Joe's, yet nonetheless, case studies like hers can be illustrative. I mean, one of my transhumanist colleagues, Anders Sandberg, reports that, yeah, quote, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point, and he is socially responsible, intellectually productive. He is just lucky in that, whereas most people between, let's say, spend most of their time between -2 and +2 or +3. Anders is perhaps +6 to +7 to +9. And essentially, yeah, your hedonic range, hedonic set point can be recalibrated upwards. If today the hedonic range is, let's say, conventionally speaking, -10, abject despair, to hedonic 0, neutral to +10, be possible to ratchet things up, and one can look at future timescales. One could eventually have a civilization of, let's say, +15 to +30, maybe much further ahead, a civilization of +90 to a +100 hedonic. Just essentially the lowest depths of post-human civilization are likely to be far richer than today's peak experiences. Now, I mean, this probably sounds quite fantastical to a lot of people. Fair enough. And I think what is morally urgent is fixing the problem of suffering. I mean, I mentioned Jo Cameron a couple of minutes ago. Transpires that she has unusual alleles of the far and far out genes, and they regulate levels of anandamide, from the Sanskrit for bliss. Anandamide is an endogenous cannabinoid molecule. And essentially, it's going to be a choice. You're going to be able to choose what levels of what levels of anandamide, what versions of the far and far out gene you and your future offspring enjoy. There is clearly a case for controlled trials. I anticipate things going wrong. I can also imagine, here in the UK, I don't know what the figures are for the US, something like 1 in 7 kids ends up in casualty each year, generally for not too serious, but doing something stupid or reckless. One needs to be very careful with playing around with something like pain thresholds. Yet, nonetheless, anyone who has experienced, as sadly many people do, severe pain or a pain disorder, pain is an absolutely frightful phenomenon, and we can choose what levels of pain, what levels of emotional pain to people are predisposed to undergo. Uh, and yeah, if I
Well,
the
I
pitfalls
really
are
like
innumerable.
yeah,
Yeah.
I like your perspective of that though, because the main thing I always try and push for towards anything is just being prepared on things. Like, not saying that it's going to go bad, but just be prepared in case there is a small thing or something that someone's going to bring up. Make sure you have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. But when it lands in a level of, like, when we talk about physical, that threshold, those being able to change that, but also the mental as well too. this is where suffering, I mean, it might be a wrong opinion for a lot of people, but I also think suffering is needed in a sense as well too. Mentally, when it comes to like you get a Mike Tyson fighter, Mike Tyson's life was hell. But came out to be a best fighter. He used it to his advantage. Now, is he an outlier? Yes, he is. But we land in this range of like there are some suffering that cause people who are bullied in a sense to want to excel their life and be better than before. You get a person like George St. Pierre who eventually met his bully and actually helped him out, gave him money. That's like the ultimate win. But you land in a realm where some people can't handle that pain and suffering. And that's where you see suicide numbers go up. So being able to fix that, this would be a perfect thing for being able to fix those issues. I think it's just being aware of every possible scenario when we talk about when you look at society advancing forward, are we still going to have advanced thinkers or advanced people that haven't been through those pains? Elon Musk, for instance, is another example doing Bitcoin and Tesla. He was thrown down a flight of stairs when he was in, it was at high school and was hospitalized for a week and a half. In this area or this kind of point where it's like, are you going to eventually see the increase in people that are going to be more negligent with their lives when it comes to a fact of people are like, oh, I can handle a lot of pain. And you start having maybe UFC fights or all these things won't be that appealing because you'll have more people participating because they can handle more pain. These are some issues as well, too. But the positives, in a sense, I mean, they are numerous to people that have a construction worker injury. I know so many construction workers that literally get drunk while they're on the job. They're not supposed to. I'm not going to name names, but it's because they have a pain or some type of back issue. I know so many people, if you just ask, hey, do you have a sports injury? They're like, oh, yeah, in high school, it stopped me from going pro. I think everybody knows somebody who said that it stopped them from going pro. That's because if we can fix that pain, if we can make sure that people don't have severe back injuries, then you would increase a lot of happiness. I love it how you did it so slow. That was perfect. Um, but you land in this point where you don't want people to be in pain, but at the same time, does pain create growth? Is there a way to manage it to where we're not going to be able to move the scale to a point where people can just be like, I had a breakup, increase my pain threshold? I don't like that idea, but I do like the idea of someone who has a crippling injury that is stopping them from going outside and experiencing the world. Fix that issue. I feel like we got to talk about these types of things because it gets it on the right track. And your perspective on being prepared that there might be a one death out of seven or something, that's in that same ballpark of thinking. Be aware of this type of stuff too to make sure it's excelling in the best possible direction.
Oh, if it were a case of one death out of seven, it would be socially unacceptable. If it were that high, I was just illustrating
Yeah.
one of the pitfalls of a much higher pain threshold. You made some very interesting points there. The question isn't, I think, whether pain, suffering, malaise can't sometimes be instructive. The question is whether the raw fields of suffering are computationally, functionally indispensable, or whether we should be shifting to a more civilized signaling system, life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss. And one of the ways in which the AI revolution is so instructive is that the revolution has been marked by this progressive divorce of intelligent behavior from consciousness, as we see that sort of digital zombies are outperforming humans in so many cognitive domains. So, yeah, the raw feels of unpleasantness or anxiety or depression or whatnot are not needed for Deep Blue or whatever to beat you or me at chess. Um, and yeah, there's going to be one option is smart prostheses. So instead of the nasty, ghastly raw feels of pain, let's say you have an implant that ensures your hand withdraws from the hot stove before you damage yourself. The other option, as I said, is just shifting to a signaling system of gradients, information sensitive gradients of well being. Uh, gradients of well-being, information that's of gradients of well-being are advantageous for all kinds of ways, because one of the big problems of traditional versions of utopia and paradise is that they tend to involve overriding people's values and preferences in favor of someone else's version of the good life. Whereas if your approximate hedonic set point and hedonic range are ratcheted up, you just imagine waking up tomorrow morning in an extraordinarily good mood, but with your relationships and your core values and preferences intact. And this approach circumvents the fact that humans, we're social primates. So many of our values and preferences involve conflict with other people's values and preferences, and there is simply logically no way to reconcile everything from football supporters to politics to you name it. It is logically impossible to satisfy most of these preferences and desires. But what one can do with hedonic uplift is to raise everyone's default quality of life. And yeah, whenever possible, I try to avoid talking about my conception of the good life and paradise and encourage people to imagine their own. Because,
Well, how do you do that without warping reality? Because the way, like, the way I'm understanding it, it's probably not this extreme of like being in the matrix where you're kind of like this. But if you're able to, let's say, if someone's worried about bills or something, or worried about something coming down the line, you're able to kind of eliminate that worry feature aspect of it and make it so it's like, yo, you don't have to worry about that type of pain, the stress that you're causing to yourself, the depression that you're causing to yourself, but without warping your reality of like losing your home because you're not paying your bills. You know, I start picturing like what's on your back wall with the beach scenario, where a bunch of people feel like they're on a beach drinking a Heineken, and it's not true. They're really in an office space. I mean, that's where people are going to want to take it. They're going to want to feel like when they're at work, they're not actually at work. But then do you see creativity fall? Do you see production fall? Do you see all these other aspects fall with the thing that you take out? I mean, that's a sensitive thing in general. There's probably a better method or ideas about this of how to make sure that we don't mess with those things. But these are just problems I feel like the general public will have questions about.
Yes, I mean, it'll be impossible massively to enrich not just hedonic tone, but motivation. Already today, and this is unintuitive perhaps, the happiest people tend to be the most motivated. It's depressives who get stuck in a rut, nothing excites them, they're anhedonic, they're not motivated to do things. And yeah, essentially, they are variables. We can tweak the dials for both hedonic tone and motivation. And it's not as though that people, there will be multiple challenges to life, but if your default hedonic tone is much higher, they are much easier to deal with. I'm torn, you see, because yeah, we could spend a dozen episodes discussing all the possible scenarios where things could go wrong. But if we are not prepared to tackle the biological genetic roots of suffering, then pain and misery will persist indefinitely. So I think we want an intelligent debate as a society as to whether we want to conserve the biological genetic status quo. I'm sounding like a very crude biotechnological determinist. It's all genes and biology and neurotransmitters. I'm not. We could be discussing everything from universal basic income, access to healthcare, all the kind of social, environmental ways we can improve life too. But unless we actually tackle the biological genetic roots of the problem, then yeah, suffering will persist indefinitely.
if you're able to adjust the biological processes in a sort, would we be at a perfect society? Would we be way farther excelled past where we are now? Besides, like the outliers of pain and creating creativity, in a sense, will we be on another planet already? Because a lot of what does come to human kind of sacrifice, or humans kind of 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, is an aspect of egos as well too. If you're able to make everyone on the same level, yeah, you're not going to have exceptional superstars, but at the same time, you won't have probably as much judgment as there is today. People jealous of what people have or have maybe ability wise. I see a Bob Ross painting and I'm pissed because I can't do that. But that's not me then. So then I just go on to something else. But a lot of people focus in on that and they never let it go. So I wonder, would we be colonizing all planets already? Would we be solving? Would there be war if we were able to make everyone's pain threshold or these things from a genetic standpoint? Are we make it so we're all more of an equal in a sense?
Um, it needn't radical hedonic uplift needn't be strictly egalitarian, but there's a fundamental difference. If you get, let's say, a 20% pay rise and your colleagues get a 30% pay rise, uh, chances are you're going to be cheesed off. You're actually going to be less happy. Whereas if you get 20% or more hedonic uplift, then even if your colleagues had an intervention that gave them 30% hedonic uplift, you would still subjectively be much better off. In practice, hedonic uplift won't, almost certainly won't work like that. There's no need for the substrates of well-being to be rationed. In terms of the nature of transhuman society. I mean, clearly this is speculative. I'd hesitate to say a perfect society. I mean, the World Health Organization defines health in terms of complete physical, emotional, social well-being. Now, that would be a perfect society. That would be utopian. But in a sense, the transhuman vision that I'm sketching, a world animated by information sensitive gradients of well-being, it offers scope for doing everything from space exploration to to the sky's the limit. So I wouldn't say it's going to lead to a brave new world society, but in some sense, yeah, the world's last experience below hedonic zero, it'll be a momentous, ethically momentous transition in the evolution of life in the universe, and that's what I think we should be striving for.
Do you find that it's being accepted, like more people are being open to this discussion as technology progresses forward? And if there is a positive kind of take on this as well too, is it being started somewhere? Like where's the first implementations of it? Can we start it with animals? Can we, I don't want to say animal testing is good, but is there willing subjects that want to start doing this? Like is it open up to that level yet?
Well, the abolitionist project has multiple strands in both humans, domestic non-human animals, and wild animals. And yeah, so far we have been discussing primarily human society, but we're seeing with the development and the imminent commercialization of cultured meat and animal products, this is going to lead to a dietary transition. I think once most people have made the transition to cruelty-free cultured meat and animal products, then it's going to be possible to get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut and outlawed. Yeah, that's the worst source probably of severe and readily avoidable suffering in the world today is animal agriculture. But looking beyond that, even free living non-human animals, those are horrendous suffering in nature, and most people probably regards the food chain, predation, and so forth as akin to this second law of thermodynamics. It must be so, as Richard Dawkins once put it. But no, the level of suffering in nature, it's an adjustable parameter. And starting off with uh, pilot studies in self-contained artificial biospheres, it would be possible, yeah, to, let's say you want to spread a benign, low-pain version of the SCN9A gene. The SCN9A gene is the volume knob for pain. It has dozens of different variants. Nonsense mutations abolish the capacity to feel pain altogether. They also abolish nociception. We're not ready for that yet. But yeah, if you pick a benign version of SCN9A, use a synthetic gene drive. Gene drives cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance. It's possible to spread desirable genes, allelic combinations throughout entire free living species. And yeah, before doing this in open field context, one will want to use pilot studies with little miniature happy biospheres. But yeah, everything from tunable gene drives to cross species fertility regulation, via contraception, that kind of thing, phasing out the horrors of predation and starvation. These are technical challenges with technical fixes, and I'm not invoking some kind of technological singularity or anything sci-fi or Kurzweilian like that. These are problems fixable with recognizable extensions of existing technologies if we have the will to do so. And something like wild animal suffering, I never thought the topic was seriously going to be discussed in my lifetime, but yeah, now little groups, organizations have sprung up exploring the problem. One of the reasons why I underestimated the pace of moral progress was that, unlike giving up meat and animal products, yeah, when it comes to discussions of wild animal suffering, you're not asking people to make personal sacrifices or anything, but simply considering these issues from a much more detached point of view. And so, when there is a wildlife documentary on TV, for example, now traditionally they're very sanitized and Disneyfied, and the camera turns away from the really gory stuff. But now, if you have, some trapped penguins or a baby elephant trapped in a waterhole or something like that, many viewers protest. Why didn't the camera crew intervene to save the poor creature? And every cubic meter of the planet is shortly going to be accessible to observation, micromanagement, and control. There are dystopian scenarios one can sketch, some kind of global panopticon, Orwellian Big Brother, but also, yeah, essentially, there's going to be the possibility of a pan-species welfare state, or so-called high-tech Jainism, and that's what I think we should be aiming for the longer run, a world in which all sentient beings can flourish.
Well, on the directional path that we are right now, without maybe this idea, how long do we have left? There's constant threats all the time. That's the big question, is the way to sell this and the way to kind of get people more interested and open to the idea of it, because a lot of people are just going to be scared of the fact of like losing who they are. That crucial element of what makes you an individual person. It might not even be that extent that it can adjust, but people don't want to take that risk. People don't choose to get hit by a car. People don't choose to have a surgery. People don't choose to do this. There might be some exceptional people that might do it as an outlier, but there's that question of losing the aspect of who they are, what makes us human. I think that idea just has to evolve. If we're looking at the positive aspect of things, I think people are getting more numb every single day and they're not even really paying attention to it. Maybe it's not our pain from if we get hit with something or something like that, but it's our emotional stimulant. We're more depressed, but we're also, when we watch and we see people die on TV, do people feel the same as if they did a couple hundred years ago? Or, It's whenever when TV or newspapers used to say there's this many people dead, I knew so many people that would be like, oh my God, that's horrible. Now that's like weird if someone does that. And I think that is a product of devices and things like that. So the main question would be, do we lose an aspect of what makes us human? And if people are thinking in that mindset, have we already lost that aspect? Is this maybe a way to bring us back?
Well, yeah, I mean, I combine being a pacifist with having killed tens of thousands of people in Call of Duty. In that sense, people are desensitized to violence. But in another sense, compared to, let's say, medieval times, most people mercifully are not experiencing violence in their everyday lives. I don't anyway want to downplay spousal abuse and ghastly phenomena and child abuse and things like that. But the level of violence in contemporary society is actually considerably reduced compared to 200 years ago, with the all important exception, sadly, of factory farming and slaughterhouses, but that's hidden from people.
What stops this from being picked up by an idea of militarization? Because even with CRISPR and China doing that, people are afraid they're going to make superhumans and things of that sort. So I'm hitting in this. This is where my mind goes, is like, I don't stop people from pulling out that personal kind of like, we got to be big and strong. Let's make our soldiers numb.
In some sense, yeah, natural selection designed coalitions of human male primates to wage war against other coalitions of human male primates. And before we start radically rewriting our genetic source code, I think we need to essentially help people, young men in particular, but not just young men, to steer their territorial aggressive instincts into virtual reality, which can offer all the joys of combat and territorial warfare and winning and so forth without the ghastliness of real war. Um,
I wonder if this can be like used to be able to make people more tolerable or less apt to be addicted to something. You know what I mean? Like, how many people suffer from alcohol addiction, food addiction, all these types of things? Like, I mean, in a sense, could CRISPR eliminate maybe the slow factors of metabolism? Possibly, could get to that point. Does that mean everybody is going to be like super skinny? Maybe not. There's some people that really don't like that, but there's some people that want to live their life however they want. But imagine you would have a lot less jealous people. You would have a lot more or a lot less personal vendetta against someone who might be overweight that looks at a skinny person and goes, how dare that person be able to eat a chocolate cake when I can't even have a carb since 2003? Now, the reason I think of that is because I'm in the fitness industry. So I'm a big workout person. So that's constantly what you get to see. You see a lot of people like, man, I haven't had a bag of chips. Like for me, for instance, I haven't had a bag of Doritos since '06. So it's like, in a sense, I probably could, but it's that mental factor that I can't get past, and that does contribute to part of misery in a sense as well too, is judgment, things of what people have and you don't. Everyone sees the Instagram vacation picture of things. I look at those aspects, like if you're able to fix certain genes or modify them in a sense in gene editing, not only increase maybe a pain threshold mentally and physically, but also be able to annihilate certain diseases, maybe not as serious as like leukemia or some type of cancer or something that could be predominant in there, but be able to fix a slow metabolism, maybe a messed up nymph or a gland in your throat or something like that, to be able to help out with hyperthyroidism. These certain scenarios that can kind of play a factor in there too. And I think that's where it starts, and it's only going to get better from there, but you need to start working on it and trying it out, having people who are willing to accept whatever happens and be able to get it more normalized so we can get that technology to get at that level already. We could be there already if people would just experiment into it. There's so many things where people bring up one side of like renewable energies. People always go, well, it's wind or it's hydro or it's this. Why does it have to be one? Why can't we have multiple different things and let it vary depending on what locations it is? But everyone has to fall in the same template. It's like every single Call of Duty. They're all the same, just different time periods. There's a small thing, but there's a basic template. And that's not humans in general.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted. You mentioned, for example, as well, I guess, sort of jealousy. Consider the drug MDMA ecstasy. On MDMA, reliably, otherwise, shall we say, a- aggressive or temperamentally jealous people can be turned into cosmic hug bunnies. On MDMA, everyone tends to love everyone else. People have this sense of, I love the world loves me. And if it had left more copies of our genes in the ancestral environment, we would be like this today rather than the MDMA like states of consciousness being an aberration. And yeah, one of the possibilities for the future will be not simply amplifying hedonic range, hedonic tone, and so forth, but yeah, changing the normal spectrum of human behavior. I mean, we might take it for granted, this kind of quasi sociopathic indifference to other humans and frequently, sadly, non human animals that we exhibit. You know, you go out on the street, and even if you're temperamentally quite an agreeable person, you're not wanting to rush up and give people hugs. If someone approaches you, you know, your heart's perhaps thinking, oh God, is he going to ask me for money, kind of thing. Life doesn't have to be like that. Um, Nonetheless, I'm cautious. The more specific one gets into, one's vision of post-human paradise, the more likely it is, excuse me, to be mistaken. So, yeah, it's going to be an option for the future. What I think is most morally urgent is getting rid of suffering. First of all, the severe forms, and then the milder forms. But then, yeah, all kinds of scenarios. So it's not a case of a perfect society, whatever exactly that would be. It is just lifting everyone up hedonically.
Kind of like an adjustment. Like a chiropractor doesn't really cure the problem. They just kind of help you and support you in a sense, add an additional benefit for however long that treatment lasts. If you believe in chiropractics, I know plenty of people that don't. But in a sense, I mean, I see it as an improvement into a lot of people's lives. It's just depending on where we tip the scales. Like already, like you can kind of talk about this. There's probably religious people out there that would think eugenics or you're trying to create a perfect society. I'm like, I think you're jumping to like from 0 to 100 real quick. Like it seems like a lot of people watch too many sci-fi movies and they're good, but I think a lot of people expect that that's what it's going to turn into. And in a sense, you got to kind of think of the logic that people would make it more different and probably not as severe as like having a laser eye or something like that. Now that does sound pretty cool now that I'm saying it, but in an aspect of making it more rational for just increasing human life, you probably would have more productivity happen as well too. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to make a certain amount of income or get a better job or be a billionaire or anything like that. It might just be elevating that scale that you're talking about and making sure people can. I mean, I bet you if you elevated that scale a little bit, not only would you see improvement in people's lives, you just have an overall probably clarity of everything. I think you would have a better rationale, and I bet a lot more problems would get fixed. I think a lot of the issues is that we surround ourselves not only with four walls in our house, we surround our minds with walls of pain and walls of fear. And I feel like if you weren't scared because maybe you were hurt, you wouldn't because that scale is increased or something, you wouldn't have to worry about maybe not taking a chance or how many people. I still think about stuff I did in elementary school. There's no reason to, but I do. But you wouldn't have that anymore if a lot of these incidences or reactions that people have weren't so painful. And that's the thing, is like predictability. How do we are able to predict what's going to be painful to someone? Everyone experiences pain at a different level, but it's the same feeling. We all know what pain feels like. You'll remember more times you feel pain than you do happiness. A lot of people don't remember what that feeling is. They'll give you an example of a color. Like happiness is blue. Happiness is this. It's like, well, what's the feeling though? I smile. No, what is that though? When I tell you you're angry, you know exactly what that feels like. That's that's something I would see a better, I guess, range of human. I would say will be having people that are able to feel more of the good times than the bad, and not talking about a drugged up society, but just a better interaction with pain, where maybe pain doesn't have to be good, but we don't have to be hurt by everything.
And there is a spectrum of pain sensitivity ranging from people, spend all of their life in excruciating pain, to other people at the other end of the spectrum who do functionally experience pain, but they'll say such things as, "Oh, pain, it's just a useful signaling mechanism." And we're starting to tease out the molecular basis of this differential pain tolerance. And before going on to a society in which literally all pain is abolished, we will, I think, want to ensure that human and non-human animals are at the extreme end of this scale, but can still respond functionally appropriately to noxious stimuli. But pain really is just a useful signaling mechanism without the unimaginable ghastliness of raw agony, as so many people unfortunately experience today.
Could that
Um,
adapt more to, like, let's say if we push that a little bit farther, instead of maybe just the sensory aspect of things, but like bones, could we make bones stronger? I don't want to sound like I'm being like really like out there, but in a sense, like that's where I could see it happen. Like I had a broken arm as a kid. Are you telling me like if we have kids that have a little bit stronger bones and over time would our bodies adapt and then that would be like the next stage? Because I look at this as evolution in a sense. Like this is man-made evolution. It's not natural, but what is natural anymore? But I look at like eventually you're the after a couple generations or so, depending at what rate or what pace you're going at, would you have people that would be, if they get hit by a car, are they able to still get up and not maybe die where before they would have died? We all know people we're stronger than we were back in the day, strength wise. Now, resiliency, wherever that may lie, maybe physically, but not mentally in a sense, it seems to be we're at a little bit of a weaker standpoint. But I look at like after implementing this or doing this and we're able to, I guess, progress the technology faster, will we have points where we would be able to maybe fix injuries better? Our regenerative healing, for instance, you get a cut, have that regenerate maybe in 2 days instead of three, those slow processes.
Yes, I mean, one of the interesting things about Joe Cameron I mentioned earlier with her extremely unusual dual far far out mutation is that she has abnormally fast wound healing. So once again, as I said before, going gung ho and giving everyone her dual mutation, trials are warranted. But yeah, it's essentially probably realistically, we are going to become cyborgs, not overnight. I mean, some people may ultimately choose not to have organic bodies at all. Other people will retain their existing organic bodies with various smart prostheses. But critically, it's going to be a question of choice. It's empowering. No one is realistically gonna force you to happy or force you to have an upgrade I mean it's yeah it's going to be a choice.
Would you want a full cyborg body if you could have one?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Is that just because immortality, or is it just because there would be so many aspects? Because I would only think of a couple of things, man. Maybe like an extendo arm. I don't know if it goes that far, but I definitely like the eye enhancement thing, or maybe something with my hearing, because I like an aspect of being able to hear more clear. Because I found myself after so many concerts asking someone, "Hey, can you? What'd you say? Say that again." They're like, "Can you not hear me?" I'm like, "No, it's like my left ear doesn't properly work."
Yeah, I've no particular attachment to a traditional organic body. uh Some transhumanists, not me, believe in the scope. There's going to be scope for mind uploading. This is the idea that you could be scanned, digitized, and converted to a less perishable substrate. That vision of immortality, but for all kinds of reasons. I'm skeptical. I think we're going to retain our neuronal core for the foreseeable future, but all the rest, everything else, yeah, it's going to be negotiable. But before one has some of these radical bodily enhancements, probably most people are going to be assuming just different avatars in immersive virtual reality. And there's obviously been a lot of hype about the metaverse, and it's not going to happen overnight. But yeah, probably more and more people are going to be spending their time in immersive virtual worlds, paradises of their own choosing. Does the future lie entirely in immersive VR? I'm skeptical here. I think ultimate power resides in whoever controls the basement, and there will always be selection pressure in the basement. Moreover, unless we actually repair and upgrade our reward circuitry, then the hedonic treadmill will still operate even in immersive virtual reality. You could be living in a paradise entirely of your choosing. You could be, I don't know, Emperor of the Galaxy, Casanova of the Cosmos, but on average, your default level of well-being or ill-being probably wouldn't be that different from now, unless we are prepared to upgrade our reward circuitry.
So I'm going to toss a really big hypothetical out there. Um, I've talked to a couple biomechanical engineer friends of mine about this possibility, but I also think with the use of technology, especially the metaverse, the people wanting to slip away into virtual reality, you're going to have like two branch off sets of humans. You're going to have the more physical ones, the people like myself that rather stay in the real world and do like lifting or do whatever. But then there'll people let their bodies just, I wouldn't say atrophy, but they would let their bodies kind of lose a lot of its crucial aspects, like the movie Wally, where everybody has on floating beds and aspects, but they would never leave the virtual reality. Then I start wondering, when will, if our subconscious, like you were talking about, some futurists that kind of land in this area of like uploading yourself digitally, when is that going to be digitally native? I mean, you're having kids grow up with technology where they are digitally native. They're used to this aspect and they know how to work it better than anything. They're some of the best hackers at the age of 14 or 13. And I land in this realm of like, when is, we know this as the physical world. This is our physical. I can touch and do all this. But when will our subconscious forget about this physical world and that then their physical world becomes that virtual reality? You end up living in it all the time, building your homes in there. People have digital real estate now where they have an individual plot of land they can customize however they want. They could be next to Snoop Dogg if they want. Where you land in this thing of like, maybe we're not taking up real space anymore. Eventually, we're all in little a chip and a satellite, and these satellites are copies all over the solar system. So in case of an asteroid or something hits Earth, we won't have to worry because our consciousness are loaded up into a different platform. I mean, that's an interesting idea. It scares the shit out of me, but it's an interesting concept because we land in this realm of like, before we were created, where were we? Now, if you're not religious and you're just like, we just didn't exist and we just came into being, then when will that virtual reality be the normal? And we will ask the question, where were we before? If we can make life easier in the virtual reality, when does that eventually become hard? When does building a thing or this, and then next thing you know, they go even deeper than that. It's like a hat inside of a hat, inside of a hat, inside of a hat, inside of a hat.
Couple of points. Yeah, well, a lot of material there. Back to the nature of selection pressure. A few years ago, there was a tragic case of, I think it was Japanese parents who were accused of child neglect, that they were so consumed with looking after offspring in virtual reality or some kind of game or something, they neglected their child who died. Now that is an extreme example, But essentially, any predisposition to be a refusenik, to spend one's time in basement reality, is going to be selected for over people who want to spend all their life in virtual reality. Because essentially, if you spending all your life in virtual reality and you're not in the mating and dating game in basement reality, you're not going to spread copies of your genes. So that's, yeah, the argument from selection pressure is why I think that, yeah, ultimate power resides in the basement. Um, Other points you mentioned before we forget it. Yeah, this issue of mind uploading consciousness in other substrates. I'm ultimately a functionalist, but I don't think classical digital computers, classical Turing machines, can solve the binding problem. They're not subjects of experience. The binding problem is the mystery that even if consciousness is fundamental to the world, or even if your individual neurons are conscious, why is it that right now you're a subject of experience capable of local binding, experiencing individual perceptual objects, and global binding, the unity of the self, the unity of perception? That classical Turing machines, yeah, essentially they're zombies, possibly micro experiential zombies, but there's no phenomenal unity there. And in that sense, they're computationally crippled. But this is a controversial view. So, yeah, I don't think there is going to be mind uploading. I'm not a believer in the so called intelligence explosion. That's recursively self improving software based AI that goes Foom. I think post-human superintelligence will be genetically written AI enhanced descendants.
I
But yeah, just
Yeah, I about to say I'm not a fan of the mind uploading thing either, but because I'm very sensitive when it comes to our brains. I just feel like there's a small thing that could easily be messed up or something, especially when you do like a brain surgery or something, as well as the science is and the technology is. I just don't feel like your lid should ever come off your dome in a sense. The top should never pop off. But I do land in this area where, without being a hypocrite, if I do decide to get a physical attachment and they're able to fix maybe a complication of just unsynchronicity where it's like your body starts to reject the foreign object like it does do with bullet wounds that people can't dig out of their skin. Their body will eventually push it out of them. It just takes a lot of time. They always reject the foreign object. It's not synced up with our DNA. If that doesn't happen with an implant, what about, you're going to have to go through someone's head to be able to make sure that those neurons and everything function to be able to move that frequently. I mean, maybe I'm just playing too much Star Wars or something and I'm landing in this realm of Darth Vader, but I start to wonder, without, if I want to get like, I could normalize having a robotic hand. I think that would be cool as hell. But when I land in this area of, you're going to have to end up opening up my head, that starts to become an issue. Now, the more that this becomes normalized, it's much like the metaverse. People say metaverse now, and everyone's like, oh, yeah, it's the metaverse. Everyone knows what the metaverse is. Well, a couple months ago, that wasn't the same case. A couple months ago, people were freaking out thinking that the whole world was about to be owned by Zuckerberg and we're going to have to run off Zuckbucks. So you land in this area where it's like, is it a possible thing where it just needs to become something that people become more normalized to, and society will eventually accept it? Or do you think that this is going to be just completely rejected in only certain few cases, like billionaires or something, where people are going to pick it up? I mean, that's my only thought, because I know billionaires are going to be the first people, like Elon Musk, that want the Neuralink and all that. But I also think it lands in this area of, if it's the idea that you're saying, it's going to have to start off with just the common person as well, because it is about the benefit for the human species rather than just the benefit of people who can afford it. I think it'll be eventually picked up and adopted by most of society at that point. It's about normalizing it, though, because even if you want to call it its infancy stages or its preconceptional phases, it just needs more time. It needs that layer. It needs that extra effort of support rather than, I guess, expulsion of idea.
Yes, and I think this is one of the worry people have with broadly transhuman technologies, that they're going to be the prerogative of the rich elite. But essentially, anything that can be digitized could be made available to everyone, which is, why, people in sub-Saharan Africa can have smartphones that, the rest of the world, the world can download movies, have a music collection as good as Elon Musk or Bill Gates. The price of something like genome sequencing is collapsing. Only a privileged elite can have status goods. You can't have an unlimited number of status goods. So in that sense, only the very rich can ever own a Mona Lisa, some, so something like that. But if you can have a digital copy that is indistinguishable from the original, does it matter that there's only one copy of a particular painting or whatnot? Yeah, I mean, so many issues here. I've barely scratched the surface. But as I said, as far as we can tell, there's no reason why the substrates of well-being need to be rationed. Status goods, yeah, until we abolish competitive status seeking, which will take some fairly radical biological genetic interventions, the powerful will always want to show off their status. But even the least fortunate members of society can instill, if we're prepared to edit our genetic source code, enjoy a level of well-being that puts them far, far above today's hedonic outliers.
Do you think it would lead to a deeper understanding of others or the human experience, or do you think it would disconnect us even more from what the human experience is? Because I think we all know our own experience, and that's a lot of what people's motions or moves tend to be. I think that's what people would call being selfish in a sense. But I lead down this point of like, would it enhance our human experience, or would it make it even more ununderstandable, because you land in this point of like you might not experience pain. You might have an overall acceptance or happiness more of life because of this advancement. But does that cause you to be more disconnected from what the other person might experience? Now, if me and you were both in a sewer and we're eating out of a can of beans, we're both having a pretty bad time, even though we're in the pleasure of each other's company. It's not a good experience. We share that. But imagine if you're able to mess with something and someone makes it more, I guess, less, you'd be less connected as people if you can't understand what the same thing the other person is experiencing.
And one of the reasons I find the idea of MDMA-like consciousness so appealing is that MDMA induces not simply euphoria, but empathy, empathetic hug drugs. And we do need to be very careful that if we are raising hedonic tone, radical hedonic uplift, that, we aren't losing empathy and compassion. But I think it's going to be far better if people are empathizing with each other's pleasures and joys rather than today, where empathy generally involves commiserating people with their suffering. I mean, you get extreme cases of something like mirror touch synesthesia. If someone is a mirror touch synesthete, they would, if you catch your hand in the door, the mirror touch synesthete would experience pain as if it were his own or her own. Empathy needs to be finely calibrated. If one were too empathetic, one would simply be overwhelmed by the by the suffering in the world. It would be too much. So it's a problem, to be aware of. But that's why, the case studies are suggestive. I mentioned earlier, Joe Cameron. She's, a compassionate vegan school teacher. By itself, being happy doesn't reduce compassion for others. If anything, a lot of suffering, it tends to embitter people. It would nice, it might be good to report that a great deal of pain, suffering, depression made people full of love and empathy and compassion for the suffering of others. Sadly, it often warps and embitters.
I'm not shooting down your idea. I don't want you to think that at all. I'm
Oh, no, no, no.
no, no,
It's
no,
good
no.
you're putting these questions.
I'm
Yeah,
just a
yeah.
natural. I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm not a Debbie Downer, but I have the. I like to think of the challenges before I think of the positive stuff because it's like eating the broccoli before the steak. I'm like, I want to get to the steak, but at the same time, I also want to tear up that broccoli first, so I don't have to worry about it later. And that's kind of where I look at the
I would
preparedness of things.
urge you to renounce the steak and go for the cruelty-free vegan alternative.
It's. I haven't eaten red meat in like 10 years. It was an example, but.
That was just double checking.
I'm not
No,
a vegan either. I have a one of those complicated issues that this technology could fix, which is a digestive system problem. So I only do like shakes and stuff like that. So finding a more balanced approach to health concerns when it comes to not only all an overall scale change, but just an aspect of being able to modify genetics to a point. Now, here's a better question. Here's a really big one. Is this only going to be for younger generations that are coming up? Is this going to be something that we can implement? And I'm not talking about just drugging people. We don't want to repeat like Operation Midnight Climax with the CIA. We want to talk about something where people who are wanting to get this done, who are already created or already living their life, maybe all full into their elderly years, are able to take a pill, but not something that they keep coming back to, something that will overall, like kind of like a vaccine or something, be able to change. Except this time you don't have to worry about a booster. You just get the one and then you're good.
yes, this is it. It's not simply a case, though it's critically important, of germline therapy for future generations. Existing people will be able to benefit. I mean, not tomorrow, but yeah, within the next 10 to 15 years. I mentioned gene trials. You too could have Joe Cameron's version of the far and far out gene. Um, I'm torn because I'm actually temperamentally a pessimist. I said I personally think life on Earth is monstrous, a monstrous engine for the creation of suffering, and yeah, I see that the death spasms of Darwinian life are going to be ghastly, horrendous suffering. I can imagine just so many things going wrong and more besides. And so my optimism, for want of a better word, is technical. And in some ways, it's not even a very inspiring message. Only a few hundred years of suffering to go. I'm not a Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil, front cover of Time magazine, 2045, the year humans become immortal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll see.
it's just far enough away to be not totally implausible, and yet near enough, in a sense, to feel real. Whereas some, at least, of the enhancements I discuss and the technologies are not going to be deployed until later this century, next century, and beyond. I think the biggest obstacles are socio-political and simply status quo bias. I mean, most parents are still, not ready to take responsibility for their future children's health by choosing their genetic makeup. It's and if they do so, earlier in the discussion we talked about, you mentioned autism, for example. Um, but many of the genes, alleles associated with high intelligence, in the narrow autistic sense of intelligence measured by IQ tests, are actually so called autism genes, autism alleles, we have an extremely impoverished conception of intelligence. And yeah, if prospective parents, in an ill-advised, ill-considered way, start trying to raise their children's IQs, one will actually get kids that are much higher on the autistic spectrum. It's a continuum. The world isn't divided into Asperger's and non-Asperger's. It's men tend to score more highly on the autism scale than women. That Asperger's has been described as a version of the extreme male brain. But some of the greatest achievements of our civilization, from Newton downwards, have been actually achieved by people with Asperger's. So this is one of the many pitfalls of using a gene therapy. The first CRISPR babies in the news a few years ago. The cover story of the scientist in question was that the CRISPR babies were going to be protected from HIV, but the particular mutation in question, induced in so-called animal models, enhances cognitive performance. And almost certainly the Chinese scientist in question was aware of this and was trying to create smart babies with or without the parents' consent. I suspect if the parents did know, they'd have been happy. Chinese parents tend to be very ambitious. So when we talk about creating designer babies, I think the moral imperative is to minimize involuntary suffering. Then sure, it is, I think, good to have smart kids. But ethically speaking, bringing new suffering into the world, it's a momentous decision and not to be taken lightly.
Well, David, I really appreciate you giving me your time and being able to talk about this too. I know I had a lot of questions for you and everything was a little bit more out there than probably you're used to, but it was a pleasure all the same. Is there a place where people can find you? Any of your links, Twitter, social media links, any websites?
Well, I'm on where else? Facebook. But my original Motherlode website from 1996 and the style to match is headweb.com. That's HEDWEB.com. Headweb.com. HEDWEB.com. And feel free to drop me a line if any of the issues we've covered you think deserve treatment in greater depth. But very much appreciated. Thank you, Robbie, for inviting me on your show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.